Hello, everyone. My name is Joshua Gilliland. I'm one of the founding attorneys of the Legal Geeks. Thank you for tuning in to our podcast, where we are beginning a series on the rise of Skywalker. This first episode will get into the issue of how to defend Ben Solo for his crimes as Kylo Ren. Joining me for the discussion today is Los Angeles County Superior Court Judge Carol Najera and California attorney Sylvia La Rosa. Judge Najera is a lifelong Star Wars fan. She's been going to Comic-Con since the 1980s, and her chambers are full of Star Wars, Marvel, and DC collectibles. They're truly a sight to see. Sylvia is a fellow McGeorge grad, and she was the first law student to sign up for the first law school mock trial we did, which was the trial of the Winter Soldier. Sylvia led the prosecution team and did an exceptional job. She also participated in our mutant rights mock trial, which delved into the issue whether or not the federal government could use sentinels to hunt mutants based upon their DNA. I'm very proud of Sylvia. She's a wonderful human being and an excellent attorney, and I'm again glad she could join us for this podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Unlock Stories. I wrote a chapter for this book and really had a lot of fun doing it. My chapter is about an app that allows people to send text messages with the dead. I had a lot of fun creating an obscure science fiction convention for a significant part of the story. And each chapter talks about different apps that people interact with, and the characters go on different adventures. The book is available on Apple Books, Amazon, and Kindle, and highly recommend you check it out if you enjoy my blogging on the Legal Geeks. Now, on with the podcast. Your Honor, Sylvia, how are you both today?
Good, thank you.
Well, let's start with the obvious. The obvious crime that jumps off the page, of course, is the situation, and I'm not going to label it murder because that's a legal term, but the incident involving his father, Han Solo, of course, because all of the other incidences that, of course, Ben was involved with, we could arguably say that was as a result of him acting as a military or political figure. So let's just deal with the one that's absolutely clear, the incident involving his father. Now, some might characterize that as obviously a deliberate, premeditated first-degree murder because he knew his father was there. He went out there and it seemed like he was exhibiting a direct intent to kill his father. He might have even said some words that could be construed that way. But let's look at this in terms of his possible defenses to that. And I see two, actually. The first one would be a complete defense, which would be not guilty by reason of insanity. Now let's talk a little bit about the insanity defense. The insanity defense works if you have a situation where you have an individual who commits an act, and even though it's a volitional act, he does it because he or she does not understand the rightness or the wrongness of what they're doing. Now let's look at Ben's background, shall we? Ben was raised by two parents who, well, he wasn't even raised by his two parents. He had two parents, the two most important people in his life, the people that should have taught him right and wrong. And where were they in his life? You had a mother who was an absentee mother. She was running off throughout the galaxy, basically more involved in causes than she was with her own son. She was more involved in rebuilding the Federation than she was in the care and well-being and mental health of her son. And then we have Han Solo. And I think Luke put it best when he told Rey, well, Han was being Han. Now, what does that really mean? Well, we know a little bit about Han Solo, and we know that his background was that he didn't have much in terms of parenting, and he didn't have any parenting skills, and he didn't really seem like the type who wanted to be a parent. He wanted adventure. He wanted to take off and have adventures and excitement throughout the universe. So they leave this poor little boy in the care of the one person that this boy bonds with, the only person that matters to him, and that's his uncle, Luke Skywalker. And at a pivotal moment in his life, it looks like just past puberty, in fact, this uncle, this person that he has put all of his trust in because his parents weren't there, betrayed him. And he ran away. Betrayed him in the most horrific way possible because he tried to kill him. So poor Ben runs away and he joins a cult, and he meets a charismatic cult leader, Snook, who basically convinces him that the right thing to do is to bring order to the universe. And what is right is to get rid of all of these rebels and get rid of this federation and bring back the empire, which brought order to the world and order to the galaxy, and people would be taken care of. And this was right. And when he's facing his father back in, and they have their final face off, he tells his father, I need to, bring order to the world. I need to fix things, and you're holding me back. So he believes that what he's doing is right. He cannot distinguish between right and wrong. So he clearly has a insanity defense. And if some psychiatrists may disagree with that, at the very worst, what he's done is a voluntary manslaughter, because in California, at least, we have this thing called the imperfect self-defense. And what the imperfect self-defense is that if somebody believes that they're in imminent danger of physical harm or death, even if that belief isn't in rationality, it's an honest but irrational belief, then that is enough to lower a first-degree murder to a manslaughter, a voluntary manslaughter. And in this case, when Ben Solo was Kylo Ren, he believed that his father was trying to destroy Kylo Ren, who was his alternate personality. And the only way he could protect himself, save himself, was by killing his father. And he said as much on the bridge. So I think between those two legal theories, at the very best, we can find him not guilty by reason of insanity and have him sent to a place where he can receive the treatment he deserves. Or at the very worst, it's a voluntary manslaughter. What do you think?
Well, thank you, Your Honor. That is very insightful. Before Sylvia jumps in, we can talk about the bridge scene, and I've pulled up the transcript, and let's just go over for this. We have Han Solo on Starkiller Base call out Ben, and this is when we learn that Kylo Ren's real name is Ben Solo. And Kylo Ren's response is, Han Solo, I've been waiting for this for a long time. Han's reply, take off that mask. You don't need it. Kylo, what do you think you'll see if I do? The face of my son. Kylo, your son is gone. He was weak and foolish like his father. Han, that's what Snoke wants you to believe, but it's not true. My son is alive. Now, this goes on with, whether or not it's too late to come home, and Han saying it's not too late. Leave here with me. Come home. We miss you. And Kylo saying, I'm being torn apart. I want to be free of this pain. I know what I have to do, but I don't know if I have the strength to do it. Will you help me? Han, yes, anything. Kylo then ignites the lightsaber and kills Han Solo, and then says, thank you, and drops his father off into the bottomless pit. So that's the bridge scene. Now, Sylvia, your take on this, and whether or not getting into the issue of Ben Solo, whether or not he had the ability to distinguish between right and wrong because of the dark side, or if the dark side made him act under a delusional compulsion. What are your thoughts?
Well, I definitely was going towards not guilty by reason of insanity as a defense, but at the same time, it's like he very well knew what he was doing. He knew what he had to do. He was going back and forth. He struggled a lot in Rise of Skywalker with going back and forth between the dark side and being Ben Solo, essentially. So I don't think not guilty by reason of insanity, because if that's the case, then we can compare it to like gang crimes, where people are committing crimes on behalf of the gang. Kylo Ren's committing crimes on behalf of the Empire, and it's like, then is every gang member going to say because they were committing crimes on behalf of the gang, because they were being controlled, because that was their family, because they felt their title or whatever was in danger? If he had stuck to the dark side the entire time and not struggled with teeter-tottering on both sides kind of thing, maybe I would believe the not guilty by reason of insanity a little bit more. But I do think that is viable. It's totally reasonable that he was being controlled, but his going back and forth was very not convincing of a reason of insanity. And I would take it and put it in like real life situations. I know we're not, Star Wars, it's not real life, but but at the same time, it's like, can every gang member say I was being controlled by my gang leaders? You know what I mean? So it's just, I'm looking at it from that aspect kind of thing.
Well, let's talk about some of the other crimes and then jump into this, because let's talk about the other crimes first, and I'll share my view. So when from what we know of his history, Ben Solo was at Luke's Jedi Academy. The confrontation with his uncle resulted in Ben becoming Kylo Ren, and he then killed 7 or 8 students at the Jedi Academy and left with a few survivors. We have the comics that talk about the in-between period. Beginning of The Force Awakens at Jakku, we see Kylo Ren murder Lor San Tekka. We see Kylo order killing civilians, which is a war crime. We then have the kidnapping and torture of Poe Dameron. We see workplace bullying. We see the destruction of the New Republic, even though it's Hux giving the order that he's very much inner circle. We have the homicide. We then jump to The Last Jedi. We have the coup d'etat against Snoke, which issues there. We have the Battle of Crate, in which he orders all the members of the Resistance killed. And then we have kind of like the Force stalking of Rey, which is like a form of harassment and stalking. It's like, it's creepy. I was not team redemption, but that worked for me in Rise of Skywalker. And like, I was very surprised because I thought it was one of the more effective things that they did, because I flipped, because I was very much, he's a war criminal, we're done. And the scene with Han on the Death Star wreckage really worked for me, with choosing what to be, and Leia breaking the connection from Palpatine. But I think it's worth discussing, and this is where expert testimony I think would probably be the most helpful with this, is the Emperor was every voice that Ben Solo heard. So he, appeared as Snoke, he appeared as Vader, he, influenced and manipulated. Is that enough for an insanity defense? And because we don't quite have anything like that. We don't have mind control cases. Now there are occasional cult cases, whether or not someone could leave a cult, but as Sylvia raised, like with the gang issue, I think that's different than cult. Your Honor, have you dealt with any cult type cases?
Not cult-like cases, but upon hearing about remembering what the transcript said, in terms of mental disease, defects, and disorders, that sounds a lot like dissociative identity disorder. And if he's suffering from DID, as they call it, and that's a very real accepted diagnosis in the DSM, and that can absolutely mitigate his mental state, then what caused this dissociative identity disorder? And what harkens back to all the things we talked about, his absentee parents, and the fact that the Emperor could totally take him over as a result of that. Because even in the discussion on the bridge, you can see it's almost like two people. He's talking about two completely different people. And it's clearly coming. This isn't a fake. He isn't malingering. He isn't making this up. He believes there are two different people here. And at the end, when Leia breaks the bond between he and Palpatine, it's clear his shattered personality has become one. He has managed to become the entity that he should have been, the person that he should have been. And when his personality heals, that's when he becomes the heroic figure that we see. And so in that regard, since there's evidence that in fact he was suffering from DID, and evidence that in fact they have managed to reunite his personalities, I think that he's got a good mental defense there, and I think the evidence bears it out.
Yeah. Sylvia, did you, I'll share my thoughts, but did you notice like a difference in how Ben, post talking to the memory of Han, how he carried himself after that exchange on the Death Star wreckage versus before, when he's menacing, giving orders on, to first order officers and raging, and the way he interacts with Rey versus after his exchange with his father.
Yeah, well, there was definitely a lot of character development, I think, on his part. I think the struggle was a lot more obvious to watchers after that, especially in Rise of Skywalker. Like, I was not Team Redemption, just like you, until I saw everything he was doing in Rise of Skywalker, and I was like, no! So I was very wanting him to stick around, per se, because I liked who he became and the character building that occurred. And I didn't actually think about the dissociative disorder, identity disorder. But yeah, that's literally complete sense, because he believed Kylo Ren was one person and Ben Solo was a different person. And so the whole development, I did think that as the movie progressed, I think his character progressed too, and he was able to take on those personality challenges, essentially. So,
in my view, Kylo Ren was the moody emo Vader, mentally unhinged, rage, angry, beating people up. Sure, Vader killed people who made mistakes, but Kylo seemed more personal about it, just angry.
I think his heart, him having a heart and feeling, was coming to fruition the more the character developed, emotion and resentment or love or whatever it was. I would have liked to see more development between him and Rey, but that's a side story.
Well, who wouldn't?
Yeah. Again, I don't feel that way, but that's okay. When Ben steals a TIE fighter, and that looked like an Imperial TIE fighter, so a TIE fighter survived the explosion, and he jump-started a 35-year-old TIE fighter. That takes skill, so hats off there. But the way he runs around on Exegol, and doing the jump and saying "ow," he's very much like his father. I mean, it seems those are things that Han would do and say, shooting a guy, not even looking at him behind his back. It's all Han Solo type moves. And so the idea of, he is his father's son resonates, and that really worked for me. And I didn't think it would. The fact I came out on the other side with is thinking, I believe it, and I'm happy that happened. I was not expecting that. And I do think the influence of Palpatine was more than, say, Darth Vader, Anakin to becoming Vader, because I looked at Anakin just making a series of really bad decisions that were motivated by his own self-interest. Sure, it was saving his wife, but everything he did was motivated by self-interest. Sure, I'll go kill a room full of children just like that, and no questions asked. Versus Ben Solo seemed to struggle with everything.
Yeah.
And showing an influence taking place, which does work for an insanity defense. Granted, it's unlike any that we've really seen, because that doesn't happen in real life. But it surprisingly worked, and I thought it worked well.
Yeah, I definitely see that there's a lot. They built up a lot of emotional and mental issues in his whole backstory, and they all come to fruition. And then you see him struggling with basically trying to heal himself, and ultimately he does heal himself. But because he healed himself, that doesn't mean that he wasn't suffering from all of these issues beforehand, and that doesn't mean that they don't mitigate a lot of what he did.
Now, Your Honor, what would you want to see from an expert witness, to talk about whether it's, the dissociative personality disorder and evidence from them, from an expert witness, that you would want a jury to look at, and being able to make a decision on like how a case like this could turn out. Because like we need more than like, yeah, he has magnificent hair and like he did a bunch of heroic things, but he committed war crimes. Yeah, it's like
the war crimes. I mean, keep in mind that if we were taking apart everything that say Poe Dameron or someone else did, they committed some pretty horrendous things too, with this complete disregard for the civilian population. So the war crimes don't. I'm not sure I would characterize them as war crimes, because war is ugly, and a lot of what they were doing was as a result of two armies fighting against each other. So in that regard, I am not as concerned about that as I am about individual acts that he did, basically what you might say for his own personal gain or advantage. In fact, killing his father was not something that an army had marched out to do. Going after his mother, yes, that was more in line with two armies going into battle. So for me, what I would want to see, I'd like to see a forensic psychiatrist sit down and go over his history, and have a psychiatrist, a clinical psychiatrist, sit down with him and go over his whole view of his identity as Kylo Ren versus his identity as Ben Solo, and when he started to realize that maybe they were in fact one person, and how that came to be, how he felt when his mother broke the chain. All of that would have to be analyzed so they could give us a direct diagnosis. And I know the other side would want to know if there's any sign of malingering, or was any of this made up by him. But I think when you look at the evidence, that would be much harder to show that there's any kind of malingering here.
Yeah.
I'm curious if this would appear to be, would it get to a not guilty by reason of insanity, or would it stop at a 1368? Like, would he be declared, incompetent at that point?
That's a question I can't answer. That's something that the experts would have to duke out, and we'd start with 1368. But if he can, the threshold for 1368 is only if you're competent to aid in your defense. So if he can talk and he's rational and logical, then he'd get past the 1368 threshold. But and that, for those who don't know, is of course Penal Code in California, Penal Code 1368, which states if a person is unable to aid in their defense because they're delusional or incompetent in some way, then all proceedings are suspended until they become competent. So I think he'd get past the 1368, and the real question would be, is he insane, or is it just his intent? There's a lack of intent such that it could be broken. The crime of murder could be reduced to something like a manslaughter.
So Sylvia, you have the honor of being one of the, way back in law school, one of the first law students to do one of our mock trials. And that was, you were on the prosecution for the Winter Soldier, who clearly had some issues with understanding the wrongfulness of his actions.
Yeah, and it was a fun jury.
Yeah, that one jury, and the foreman was the executor to the Kirby estate, so that was cool and a fun little gem we didn't expect. But the idea, if you were playing defense attorney, and you want the jury to go back with one thing, because if we have experts testifying and we have lots of evidence, and everyone's going like, ooh, science, and there's lots of details, and you go like, well, he ordered all those people on Jakku to be killed and they were civilians. Hosnian Prime and all those plans were blown up. He killed his dad. What do you want a jury to think? Because there's a mountain of dead people. I'm like, there's lots of dead people. And how would you convince a jury? Like, what's the key evidence that you would want a jury to take back?
So I'm in my defense cap right now?
Okay. Again, your defense cap.
So I think for me, highlighting his development and humanizing him, because I think the not guilty by reason of insanity is super evident even for a jury with all that science. When you look at everything he did towards the later of Rise of Skywalker, like he took lives, but his development of finding who he really was someone who would give his life to save another, So ultimately, I think, at least in closing argument, highlighting the fact that this is what he did when he finally realized who he was, when he came to terms with who he was, when he was, I guess, essentially healed, or when, he wasn't suffering from it anymore. The real person who he was is he fought with Rey, then he gave his life to save another. That's the person we're looking at here. That's who he is, and not what he did when he was being controlled by someone else, when he didn't have control of his own persona. So I think I would want a jury to go back with the impact of the end of that. This person, Rey, who, as my witness, Rey is alive because of this individual. And that's the person we need to look at, because at the end of the day, that's who he is now. That's who he always was. He just had a struggle and was suffering from a mental disorder that was controlling him at that point, and he didn't know what he was doing, essentially. So that would be my biggest thing, is I'd prove all the mitigating evidence. I'd want the jury to take all the mitigation, all the good he did once he came to fruition about, who he really was, Ben Solo.
And I would be tempted to have Maz Kanata on the stand to play the mom card, to talk about the war hero Leia, who saved the universe multiple times, the fact that she gave her life to save her son, I think would be important to get into, because that princess from Alderaan, being the pesky, do-gooder that she is, was the one who broke the connection with Palpatine. So I think getting that in, of playing mom saved the day so Junior could stop the Emperor, or help stop the Emperor, I think would be important for the jury to take back if he had survived, because we don't prosecute dead people, but still, it's talking about what we would do. Your Honor, flipping the script, what do you think a prosecutor would come out swinging with, trying to convict Solo for the mountain of crimes that he could be charged with?
Oh, there's a mountain of evidence that he has committed, that he is guilty of committing all of the crimes that you've mentioned. He basically did it open and notoriously. As a prosecutor, you could argue that he did this not because of any internal conflict, but because basically he wanted power. He was constantly, basically in competition with those on his level and below him, because he wanted to be the next emperor. He wanted Snoke to make him emperor. He wanted the power. So you could argue that that his whole, what I previously called dissociative identity disorder, is really just a guy who is struggling with the fact that he wants all of these things, and basically he is going to do whatever he can to get them. And he is, it's not a mental issue. It's simply that he is struggling for power, and he's figured out the best route to get to that power. And if it means mowing through these people, so be it. He's made that conscious decision. He's going to do that. And at some point he realizes that there's a stronger power out there, namely the Emperor. And unless he overcomes the Emperor, he is not going to be the Emperor. So that's I would argue that the whole Rise of Skywalker is not him being redeemed, but is really him just trying to get allies so he can get rid of the Emperor, so that he can be the Emperor. Now, the twist, of course, comes at the end when he saves Rey, but you can argue that, yes, much like in the movie Crash, there are people who do terrible things, but that doesn't mean that they don't do good things when certain situations arise. And that's just what this is, just a case of him doing a good thing. It's an aberration, and ultimately his whole life was that of striving for the ultimate power.
Well, let's pivot to being Star Wars fans, and let's talk about, did his redemption work for you? And Your Honor, did it work for you?
Oh, it did. It absolutely did. I just thought it was beautiful. In the end, I was crying. It was so sad. He gave his life for this person that when you think about it, while they had an interaction mentally, they really didn't meet up a whole lot of times. And yet he was so starved for affection that this person that, was kind of like him, that he could kind of meet up with secretly in his mind, was the ultimate emotional connection for him. And that's really sad, but it was such and important because he didn't have any emotional connections. This connection with Rey was so important emotionally to him. He bonded so strongly with her that he gave up his life for her. That was just, it was tragic. And yeah, totally worked for me.
Sylvia.
Totally team redemption. I mean, Adam Driver has nothing to do with it, but no, I mean, on the bridge, I wasn't very team Kylo Ren at all, you know, and then as I saw his character development, I was just like, well, oh, and then I had a soft spot for him, and then towards the end, I would have liked, I mean, like Your Honor said also, a lot more story around him and Rey. I was waiting for it. I was like wishing for it. But I mean, if we look back at the old Star Wars as well, like Leia and Skywalker, there wasn't a lot of that, you know, that wasn't really developed as well either. So I think they just kept us always wanting more on that end. But I was definitely team redemption on that one. And then when he, you know, at the end gave her that final little kiss, and it was just like, okay, that's kind of what I was waiting for, but you had to end it just like that. Like, it was just, yeah, I was totally team Kylo Ren. Like, not all the way, not until like I saw what Ben Solo was capable of. So I was totally team
Right.
So for me, it worked, and I thought it was one of the more effective scenes. And looking at the arc of the character in Force Awakens, you know, he's just kind of a menacing gatekeeper, and he's underdeveloped. You know, he's talking to Grandpa's helmet, which means he's a grave robber, and that is desecration of the corpse. So not good. Tad creepy. I love my grandpa. I don't keep the ashes of the deceased one on my shelf to talk to, because that's weird. No. Then Last Jedi, they really developed him in an interesting way. So you see the conflict in him more so, and he's dynamic, he's frightening, he's endearing. It's like, okay, that's again Adam Driver's acting, and you know the masterful work of Rian Johnson in handling that character. And in Rise of Skywalker, you know, he's menacing and evil and raging, and you know he looks scary while doing it. And having a board meeting with him would not be fun, because there's lots of workplace bullying left and right. But what did it for me was his exchange with Han, and I think that was just the talent of Harrison Ford and Adam Driver, and in having a father-son moment, and being a Gen X male that's always liked Harrison Ford, you know, like it worked for me, you know, down to the "I know" comment. It was just like, okay, beautiful, I'm on board. And him throwing the lightsaber away shows him making the choice of realizing, okay, I screwed up bad, really bad, but I can try to make this better. Like, and that's like, we want stories of redemptions. Like, it worked. I do think it would have been more interesting if he had lived at the end, because, you know, if he shows up at the resistance party, people would have words. There would be a lot of, they're not going to go like, oh, nice sweater. Like, there's going to be words of like, hey, I'm upset about the time you tortured me. You know, like there would be a lot of that. And that would be problematic. But death was the easy out, story-wise. But yeah, it worked. It also raises the question of, you know, what does the title Rise of Skywalker mean? Does it refer to him? You know, that he chose to be a Skywalker, even though his last name's Solo, in going the hero road, or is it something else? Is it about Rey? So again, and we can get into that more on another podcast, because there's a lot to talk about with the entire name of the film. Any other thoughts on Rise of Skywalker and Kylo Ren's journey, or Ben Solo's journey?
No, it was interesting because his journey was different from anybody else's in terms of he started out as possibly like almost the New Hope. He was the young Jedi who was gonna, you know, he's gonna be Luke's successor. He was going to, you know, grow up and probably be the next Yoda. And they had this whole thing planned out for him. And then, you know, he took his life, took a left turn, and he ended up being your classic villain and then gets redeemed. And it's different because that you could say that was Darth Vader / Anakin Skywalker's story as well, except Anakin, I guess you could say they both were redeemed by love and their family members. So honestly, their story arcs are very, very, very similar in that regard. And honestly, it's almost like Luke and Leia were supporting figures in these two individuals. They're larger than life individuals whose whole stories were almost, it's like an epic, an old epic. It's, it's this huge redeeming story of redemption. And they both ended up kind of the same way. And they both ended up dead at the end after being redeemed by those who loved them. So there's a lot of parallels there. There were a lot of parallels between Kylo Ren and his / Ben Solo and his grandfather, Anakin / Darth Vader. So it's just interesting that they skipped a generation, and yet they, it makes you kind of wonder what would happen in the future with future generations. They could have broken this cycle.
Yeah, Sylvia?
No, I agree. And then I also think, at least in Ben Solo's or Kylo Ren's situation, is I think he was redeemed by someone he loved too. That just wasn't unfolded enough. Because I think at the end of the day, whatever it is that he had there for Rey kind of gave him the final push, the final okay, And so I think that it goes to show also, at least in his character, that I want to say he loved her so much that that's why, that helped him redeem himself at the end. So I think that also plays, at least for his, I think it played a role, that he loved her so much that he was like, no, this is, I belong on her side. I belong on this side. So I thought that was a good one too.
Yeah, I would not want to undervalue Leia because he was a mama's boy. Which again, I can say as a male, many of us are. And it was the death of his mom that broke it for him.
Yeah.
And with him fighting Rey and stopping because mom just died, and the significance of that shook him to his core, and which allowed Rey to stab him, and then for him to have the self-reflective moment with Han of, your mother is gone, but what she stood for is not. And I say that can't be undervalued, that it was dad, it was mom, it was Rey, all had all were forces that worked him to break the connection with Snoke or Palpatine, and then finally choose to do the right thing, because I think the connection being broken and looking at the big waves going oh, I screwed up so bad, what do I do here? It's tough to come back from making a mistake. Those were big mistakes of oh, a planet blew up, oh, I was involved with that. That's more than oh, I hung out with the wrong crowd, I became the supreme leader of the space Nazis, my real big bad. With that, we're gonna continue with these as a little series and talking about different issues. And I want to thank Judge Najera and Sylvia for taking their time with us to share their legal knowledge and fandom to talk about Ben Solo and the Rise of Skywalker. And everyone,
thank you, Josh.
You're very welcome.
Thank you for inviting us and giving us the opportunity to have this discussion. It's always fun.
It's always fun to wear a defense hat.
Yes, it is. And with that, everyone, stay geeky, America.